Welcome to another edition of the TEPHI Talks, the Texas Epidemic Public Health Institute, that we have been doing these series of presentations talking about how we can protect the public's health, but also maintain a vibrant economy going forward. These have been very informative events, and we have one that's, I think, really going to be interesting today. So thank you for taking the time to join in with us. My name is Bob Emery. I wear two hats here for the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. I'm over safety, health, environment, and risk management at the Health Science Center, and then my faculty appointments at the School of Public Health. And as part of that role, I'm involved with the TEPHI initiative here. So before introducing our speaker today, what I would like to do is kick this over to my colleague, Rocio Rodriguez, who will just explain briefly what TEPHI is, and equally important, some of kind of basic housekeeping things with regard to muting and submitting questions and how one can access the recorded talk and the like. So from there, I'm going to turn it over to Rocio.
Yes, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. TEPHI is focused on preparing Texas for the next infectious disease outbreak in collaboration with communities across the state and leaders in public health science and medicine. We're leading the charge to keep Texans safe and the economy strong.
Rocio,
yes.
Can you click resume slideshow for us?
Sure. You see it?
Perfect. Yeah, then you can point to where you're at. Thank you.
Oh yeah. Perfect. All righty. We're housed at the UT Health Houston School of Public Health. TEPHI focuses on collaborating with governmental, professional, business, and academic entities. Also, TEPHI provides additional resources to help prepare Texas communities, from webinars to online courses. Please feel free to check out our TEPHI website. Before we begin, I would like to inform the audience that you have the option to use the live transcript button that is located at the bottom of the screen. Once Eric is ready for questions, please use the Q&A and I will make sure to communicate that to him. We also ask to please complete the survey at the end of the TEPHI talk. This webinar will be available within 1 week on our TEPHI YouTube channel. Dr. Emery?
Okay, yep, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Rocio. So we are very pleased to have Eric Erickson here, the Chief Legal Officer for Port Houston, who has graciously taken time out of his schedule to speak to us about the issues encountered by Port Houston during the pandemic. But I think everybody's kind of tired of pandemic stuff, but it's more important is going forward. What are we doing? What things did we learn? And what systems are in place, because inevitably there may be something lurking in the future. So Eric serves as the Chief Legal Officer for Port Houston, overseeing its legal, public information, and records management functions. Prior to coming to Port Houston in 2005, he was involved in a legal and management positions at a multi-billion-dollar publicly listed holding company. And a more extensive listing of his bio is actually going to be available on our website. So I don't want to tie up a lot of time because I think the content's most important here. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here, and I will be addressing my my talk from the slideshow, and obviously please ask questions, and I'm happy to answer whenever I can. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm going to first start, though, before we go into sort of lessons learned from COVID and things like that. I really want to spend a bit of time first talking about the title of our talk here, the role of Houston's maritime industry, and more specifically the Houston Ship Channel. We like to think that the ship channel itself is a critical economic engine for this region and the nation. You know, as you can see from the video there, no port, no cargo, no commerce, no jobs, no channel. there are over 200 private facilities along with our public facilities along the channel. And it's really unique in the United States in terms of that mix of both private and public. You probably already know that Houston, of course, is the energy capital of the world, but really a lot to do with not just the fact that, you know, Houston is the home of and Texas is the home of a lot of hydrocarbon supplies, but also, moreover, that the channel itself is the largest petrochemical manufacturing complex in the U.S., the largest energy pipeline and storage network. The Port Houston itself operates the container facilities along the Gulf. We are, and this is really important, I think, in today's world, we're the biggest exporting region in the United States. And then finally, notwithstanding what you may hear in the media, we're actually the biggest and busiest port in the United States. Some statistics. We are the #1 in total tonnage, the #1 in petrochemicals, steel, and project cargo. You might ask what project cargo is. That runs all the way from cars, equipment, wind turbines, things like that. We also are #1 in foreign tonnage, and I think that's reflected in the nature of what Houston and our region is like and its diversity. And then finally, again, the Port of Houston itself is the #5 container facility and container complex in the U.S. We also, you can also see a little more of the statistics here. A little more statistics, and you know, we like to brag on these a little bit. We conduct surveys, and we feel confident in talking about the jobs we bring, 1.5 million jobs, over 3 million jobs around the country, almost $450 billion in economic impact, and almost $1 trillion in economic impact in the U.S. Where that all started, about 110 years ago, Houston Ship Channel opened. We have to thank our forebears for realizing that our position here at the head of Buffalo Bayou and you know, near both West Texas and East Texas, aptly provided a place in the geography of Texas to be a major exporting hub. And the ship channel was first opened in 1914, and since then it's been expanded over and over again till today. We're working right now on an expansion to bring it to 500 feet. So let me talk a little bit about our the nations and the regions that we serve with the imports and exports that we have. As you might expect, Latin America is a big export and import partner. Europe as well, traditionally a big import and export cargo. In recent years, with the expansion of the Panama Canal, East Asia has become a major site for imports in particular, and container imports and exports particularly. And then finally, other parts of Asia and other regions of the world. Let's also talk a little bit about what kind of cargo we have here at the Houston Ship Channel. Liquid bulk is obviously 67%, as you can see. That really ties to our locus as the petrochemical capital of the United States and one of the primary petrochemical hubs in the world. Again, Port Houston handles containers and some other things, and that's about 16% of the cargo. I mentioned earlier project cargo, dry bulk. Interestingly enough, we export grain here. We also have some other food products. We also have some things like cement, for example, that comes in here. A lot of those products not only support our export farm industries, but they also support our construction here locally. And then finally, general cargo can be things, you know, sort of the miscellaneous category. I sometimes look out my window, as I'm doing right now, and you can see steel pipe, as that's a type of general cargo that's used to support pipeline construction. Here again is another summary of what some of those products would be. And I'll just briefly, as you can see, both on the import and the export side, chemicals and minerals are the big drivers. And that's because, again, we're the petrochemical hub of the area, of the nation. On the container side, Port Houston operates the two container terminals. And as you can see on the import side, electronics, Walmart, IKEA, those are big. A surprising thing is there's Heineken over there at number 5. I guess we're big beer lovers. And interestingly enough, until a few years ago, Red Bull was one of our big import customers. So on the export side, a lot of the exports are the product of our local industries. So you can see ExxonMobil, Shintech, and some of those other companies that produce plastic resins and similar products. They get put into containers and then exported to some of the regions of the world where additional manufacturing occurs. Another great story about the Houston Ship Channel is our growth. You can see our containers are growing. You can see that export of plastics are growing. You can see crude oil ever since that trade lane was opened up about 8-10 years ago. You can see those exports are growing. And then finally, propane, another similar product, is growing as well. So let me move on and talk about one of our big roles, which is as the advocate and the partner with the federal government in the Houston Ship Channel. We're working right now on what we call Project 11, which is its latest construction. But let me go back for a second and just talk about how the ship channel is dredged and how this all works. The administration and Congress has to authorize projects and then has to allocate the funds towards it. And this is both for capital work as we expand it and for everyday maintenance. I come from the Northeast. I like to use as an example those of us come from the Northeast or the Midwest, snow plows, how every winter you have to get those snow plows out. The government puts them out and sends them out and cleans the streets of the snow so people can keep driving. Well, the ship channel is a little bit similar. It's not a natural channel. It's not a natural deep port. And what happens when we have rain and even just everyday drainage into the channel, silt accumulates. And so the channel has to be constantly dredged, what we call maintenance dredging. And so we work with Congress and the Army Corps to make sure the Corps has the money to do that. But aside from that everyday maintenance, which is a big job of the Army Corps, we will be working with it to expand the channel, and that brings me back to Project 11. Our last project expansion was what we call Project 10. That was completed almost 20 years ago. About 15 years ago, we realized that was not going to be sufficient for the bigger vessels. And one of the stories of international commerce, maritime commerce, is the vessels are always getting bigger. And what I like to say is that if we don't continue to improve the channel, Houston will become a backwater, literally a backwater. So we need to continue to accommodate the growth in vessels and the trade lanes where those big vessels are being put. So we started working on what we call Project 11, again, about 10, 15 years ago. The normal kind of a project would have taken at least 25 years. The chart you're seeing right now shows a 25-year lifespan. Sometimes it could be even longer. Project 10, for example, they started thinking about it in the 60s and it was only finished in 2005. So, and you hear some stories sometimes, but it's just the nature of the federal process. There's competing demands for federal funds, and so only a small bit of federal funding is going to be available in any year to pay for planning, to pay for design, to pay for construction. So we took a different path, and we decided to get hands-on. And so now we're undertaking construction. So let me show you what we're talking about here. What this project is going to be is basically widening, you can see my cursor, basically widening the reach that goes through Galveston Bay, and then widening and deepening aspects of it up here as it goes past Baytown and goes all the way up to where I'm sitting right now in the Turning Basin. And it's $1 billion project, and we basically undertook to take care of a big chunk of it. So right now, again, I moved the slide to another drawing. We finished 1A. We paid for it ourselves. We contracted. It was a huge contract. We're working right now on 1B and 2, and they're almost done. And we are about to hopefully award a contract to 1C. And once that's done, all the vessels, except the few that go to 2, all the vessels that go all the rest of the way will have a wider channel, which means a safer channel, which means a more efficient channel. And we're looking forward to that happening by the end of this year. So instead of a 25 to 35-year process, we basically started construction 2 years ago, and we anticipate being done within 3 years. So aside from the channel, though, Port Houston also has another job. We operate our public terminals here in the region. And I mentioned earlier that Houston Ship Channel is 200 private facilities, but also the public facilities. And we're a little bit analogous to a public airport, but we're also a little bit different. As we all remember, if we've been living here in Houston for a while, we used to have a Continental Airlines that was really had its hub here, and it was based in Houston, and it had ties to Houston. And you'll remember that we had some changes when United took it over, and to some degree, our public airport now is dependent on the fate of United. Well, we run our container facilities and our other public facilities a little differently. We pay for the improvements, and we're open to all facilities. So we do have the equivalent of the Uniteds. We have some of our big customers, but we have many, many customers. And so as a result, one customer can be down, one customer can be up, but we're still going to be growing. And as a result, we've consistently been able to contribute to the local economy and focused on the local economy. So let me talk a little bit about our facilities very quickly here. Barber's Cut is our oldest container facility. We started constructing that in the mid-70s. And again, those of us who at least are the baby boomers in the audience will remember that containerization became a big deal in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, until then, most cargo was unloaded, one pallet at a time, one piece at a time. Containers allowed consumer goods to be put into these large containers and then safely transported from the point of origin to the point of destination. They come to a container terminal, they're loaded on a truck, or they're loaded on a yard. We did that in the 1970s when no one else was willing to commit the dollars. We put the dollars down, and as you can see now, that facility is been expanded over the years. You can see these areas that are in blue where we're doing some construction right now. Similarly, about 15 years ago, 2007. A little more than 15 years ago, we opened up Bayport, which is our second container facility. And here you can see that we're looking west. If you're wondering, we're here in the front part. We're developing more facilities, but you can see here in the back we have our ship-to-shore cranes, container yard, and then the roadways that allow us to reach the rest of the region with the cargo that we bring in here. We do some other things, though, and I'd like to talk about that. But before I go to business equity, one of the things that I think are always worth talking about is we also help provide public rail service. I don't have a picture of a rail car here, but as have happened in many other areas, there's been consolidation in the rail business. Once upon a time, we had 18 rail lines coming to Houston, but luckily for all of us, the Houston leaders decided almost 100 years ago to provide a public access rail facility to the ship channel. It's called the Port Terminal Railway Association. We sit on that board. And as a result, notwithstanding the consolidation in our business, in our rails over the last 50 to 100 years, we still provide open access for any cargo that either can come to the Port of Houston or can leave from the ship channel area. And it's a great advantage. And in my mind, it's similar to the advantage that we provide by keeping our terminals open to all public comers. And so let me now go into some of the other things we do. We're a government agency, and we also owe a duty to our public, and we owe our duty to our stakeholders to provide opportunity. One of these areas that we spent a lot of time in the last 20 years on is what we are now calling business equity. We have goals for both small business participation and MWD participation in contracts. We have a group of folks who go out and engage with the community. We provide training. We encourage them to submit proposals to us on our contracting, and we've been able to have some substantial success. You can see on the slide here, we have almost $100 million in awards to small and MWBs in the last year. And we feel it's important not just to be open to the big businesses in the community, although of course we're always interested in efficient and price efficiency, but we also want to make sure that we're providing the growth that we offer to the community to some of the small businesses as well. Another part is our community involvement. We have a community grants program where we distribute funds to deserving small profit nonprofit companies that may be improving parks. They may be providing job education. We have a advisory council which we convene on a regular basis with commissioners and staff members, where we hear the concerns of our community members, and in turn we talk a little bit about what we're doing. We also have a regular program of engagement and participation. What you see there is we have some folks who do beach cleanup. We also do things like help clean and gather oyster shells, which are then used for seeding the population of oysters in Galveston Bay. And then finally, we have right now we're working on a parks and green spaces program where we've committed $2 million. We've already completed about $1.5 million of that work, including some parks right here in our neighborhood near 610, but then also out in East Harris County. We have education outreach. I mean, again, as a baby boomer approaching his golden years, I think it's self-evident that there's going to be turnover in our workforce, and we can, whether it's our children or our grandchildren, they're coming on, and we need to reach out and keep up an awareness of the jobs that we provide, because at the end of the day, the biggest driver of our local economy, as far as the ship channel is concerned, are the jobs that it offers, whether they're in our public terminals or whether they're in the petrochemical terminals, whether they're in the rail facilities that I mentioned, whether they're the other truck drivers or the ancillary things that result. For example, in recent years, as a result of the increase in container traffic, we've had construction and development of distribution centers. And so all of these things will need folks to contribute to it. And we reach out to educational institutions, provide training, and we also have apprenticeship and internship programs. We also try to be a good steward of the environment. As you can see from the slideshow, we were the first Port Authority to be environmentally certified as ISO, under the ISO protocol. We a couple of years ago, we periodically go out for long-term energy contracts, and a couple of years ago, we were able to successfully obtain a contract that's providing asset-backed renewable electricity, and we're going to have that for another 7 or 8 years, and I'm sure we're going to do that in the future. We also have we track and have done work to reduce our carbon footprint. We're down considerably. We have hybrid, our cranes that that are what we call the ship-to-shore cranes. They're electric, but some of the other cranes in the past were diesel, and now they're diesel electric. And we're working on electric cranes. We're also working on electric trucks, and supporting our community to implement those. I'd also mention one thing too. When we dredge the channel, the dredge material is often what's called beneficially reused, and we've created marshlands in Galveston Bay to make up for the loss of marshlands that have occurred through development over the last 100 years. Finally, let me just give a couple of other points that I make before I finish the formal part of my slideshow here. We work with what's called the Ship Channel Security District to provide security measures. As we all know, after 9/11, security became a heightened concern in this country, and the security district was really put together by the Port Authority. Now we work with the county and the cities to bolster security along the channel, because obviously it could be a target. And then we also, for 50 years now, we provide fire protection along the ship channel. So those are some of the other things we do for the community. So let me just conclude real quickly on what I like to talk about with Port Houston. Our goal is to grow the economy, not just our own bottom line. We were created in 1914 as the advocate of the ship channel. We had grain elevators 100 years ago. We had rail 100 years ago. We had the first container terminal almost 50 years ago, and opened up the major container terminal here in the Gulf area 15 years ago. And what my point here is, I mean, just like educational institutions that we're here today, we act where to seed the private sector and to do things where maybe, private capital isn't willing to go. So that's really my story on behalf of the Ship Channel. And I'd like to now go on and talk a little bit about our COVID experience. So I think I have a couple of high points about COVID. First of all, the difficulty of the transition to remote work, and I think we all experienced this. Some of the issues that we had when we had a hybrid of people on site and were working remotely, and then finally, some of the unanticipated consequences, some of the issues that we had as a governmental agency, and then finally some follow-ups, the path forward that we were talking about earlier. We were not prepared for remote work. Probably most of us had never heard of Zoom or WebEx or any of those things. And many of our group did not have laptops. So we scrambled, and this is now, it's just about 4 years ago, right? I mean, it was right around mid-March. I remember when Mayor Turner closed down the rodeo, and I think that was a sort of a wake-up call for us all. And so we scrambled, but we had a full court press from our IT group. So that was part of it. We also had, of course, we run terminals. So we had an issue where, our office staff could work remotely, but our terminal people could not. And so that continued to be the focus of the difficulties and the challenges that we had. But I would also say, and relevant, I think, to the mission of this agency, keeping up with the federal, state, and local, both the mandates and the guidance was a big job. And that was something that our legal department, and one of my colleagues in particular, had to work a lot on. Those of us who had never heard of the CDC sure learned what it was afterwards. And unfortunately, I think there were a lot of things happening. I don't have to go into detail, but I'm sure most of us who are on this call recall that there was, that we weren't always hearing one voice telling us what we should do or how to do it. And I think that added something. Sometimes even the guidance was ambiguous. Now, it's understood too, this was a developing situation. So, the scientists and the health professionals hadn't dealt with these in the past. So I don't think we really can blame anybody for that. That's just the nature of the beast. And I think, again, this exercise here will help us learn a little bit about maybe how to cope with these types of things in the future. But aside from that, those ambiguous and conflicting that advice that we got and how to communicate that to our own people, and we spent a lot of time working on communication, let me tell you that. We had to consider what it meant to be for our on-site workers. And again, we had people on the dock every day to keep things moving. We didn't really have a big dip in commerce. And a matter of fact, soon afterwards, the throughput of our terminals and it increased, I don't want to say exponentially, but significantly. We all heard about, or maybe some of you heard about the vessels, anchored outside ports waiting to come in. And we experienced that firsthand. And so we had to have people on site, and we had new situations coming up, whether it was exposure or types of interactions that we had to think about that. One of the things, again, that was relevant for the lawyers was balancing folks' privacy with, and individuals' concerns with privacy and with the fact that we also, as a group, needed to understand what circumstances were. And if someone had been, taken ill, we needed to have some guidance and some understanding. So we had to balance those things. We also had, unfortunately, some employees that felt one way about what was needed and others that felt another way. And we had to manage those types of internal conflicts. And again, our human resources group worked closely with some of our lawyers to manage that. And I think we had successful outcomes. And I think generally everybody, and I think I attribute that to the culture of the agency, everybody understood we were in this together. We had to keep carrying out our public mission of operating terminals through all those things, and we were able to do that. Another issue we had was, and I've already alluded to it, our on-site employees were being on the edge of exposure, and we had to keep that into consideration, and the fact that the folks at home, in many ways had it better, and so we had to consider how we could motivate and reward our on-site employees to keep them putting in those efforts that they could do. One of the things we worked on was we established, which is not always easy for a government agency, we established some lump sum compensation things. We also established some sick leave policies above and beyond what the federal government was mandating. So those are some of the things we did, let's just say, on the people side. But there were some other things that we had to cope with, and I think, again, not dissimilar to other businesses and other institutions, shortages. And we had to be nimble in terms of opportunistic purchasing. And so one thing when you're in a government agency, and I like to think, because of a long and sorry history of agencies that maybe did some things that they shouldn't have done, but as a result of that, every government agency has to deal with a significant amount of statutory restrictions on procurement. And in Texas, at least, agencies have limitations on how much they can buy without having a public process, and how much they can buy without having a public meeting. And we did have some laws that allowed emergency procurement and other types of emergency steps, but what we found was they weren't always considering the types of things that we were having to deal with. So we had to work closely with the laws, with our business folks, with our procurement folks, and with an eye on what the laws allowed and didn't allow, to be able to keep up with the things we had to do. I mean, and I'm not just talking about the types of masks or those types of things that were specifically oriented towards response to COVID. I mean, we have consumables that are needed to run terminals, and they became in short they became in short supply, and we had to get our hands on them, sometimes in an opportunistic fashion. Similarly, because of the congestion in our terminals, we had to do things we hadn't do before. I mean, that's just an example, and it's maybe a little bit, on the technical side. Containers move on they move on trailers, and they often can store on trailers. So there was a huge trailer shortage in the United States for several years. And so again, we had to act opportunistically in getting our hands on those and act when we could. So those types of issues were particular to a government agency, but we also had some other types of issues. In the case of COVID, we had the governor that permitted us to conduct public meetings the way we're doing now. And again, that was a whole new world for us, along with, I think, some other public agencies running meetings either in a hybrid or initially remote or virtual and then a hybrid fashion. And we've learned a lot about that. And I think we're a little better now, but we keep learning about that. But in terms of some of those issues, we also had to communicate that we're acting in a different way. So, our stakeholders are many. We had customers, we had members of the public. All of those communications had to be thought through that were a little bit different, a little bit broader, shall I say, because of our larger stakeholder community. Finally, of course, we're now in the return to work world. One last thing, and I think we've all experienced it, and whoever happens to be in the commercial real estate market is probably experiencing it more than they ever believed. Offices have become something different. People are coming in 2-3 days a week. We've had to deal with some of those changes here. We're moving into a new office building in a couple of years, and we're restructuring our office layout to respond to that. I would also say that a lot of the people who worked remotely have different expectations now, and we have to manage that. Some of my colleagues like to say that it's generational. I don't know that it's necessarily generational. I think it's also just things like, what kind of commute do you have to do? And did you realize you didn't have to commute and you could still be effective? Did you have to juggle? You had one way of juggling with childcare or elder care. When you're doing remote, you have to do it differently when you're working in the office. And so those are things where expectations and I would say the rules of engagement, so to speak, have changed. And we're still working our way through those things. But finally, I think just to sort of wrap it up a little bit, some of the follow-ups that we've done, I mentioned earlier that government agencies have some restrictions on their procurement policies. We just came off of a legislative session last year. The Port Authority, the Port Houston, worked with other Texas ports to tweak, let us say, or ask the legislature to tweak our emergency powers to expand them to contemplate things like an epidemic, to contemplate things like supply chain congestion. Whereas in the past, I mean, they were oriented to, let's say, a hurricane or something like that. And we now had an emergency that wasn't going to be over in a week. We had an emergency that lasted months and months, and our emergency powers really didn't contemplate that. I mean, we were able to work through that and at the time, but I think, looking at it afterwards, we were able to work with the legislature, and thankfully the legislature recognized the issues and allowed us to take some of our get some of our statutes changed. Similarly, our business operations, we had to contemplate that some of these emergencies might occur for long time periods. So those are some things we've done already. We continue to track, federal and state things where we never had to do that. We've had our emergency preparation folks do, after action reviews. I'm sure you're all aware of those types of things and implement some of the things that they've learned. And then finally, as we move forward in our brave new world of technology, we've learned some lessons there too. So I think all in all, we still have work to do in terms of preparing for whenever that next epidemic will come. And I think it's both technical and statutory and cultural, but I think we the generation that's sitting here is aware of it and will work it. I know I've read during COVID, I read something about the 1918-19 flu epidemic, and spoke to one of my mothers-in-law about it. And unfortunately, I think one of the things we have to realize is people forgot it as soon as it happened, as soon as it was over. And I would say that one of the important things we need to realize is that is not a good way to deal with it. That was obviously very different with transportation and communication the way it was. Maybe it allowed people to be more forgetful, but I don't think, I think the major lesson learned is just what we're here today, is that we have to learn from it.
Yep. So thank you. Amen. So, yeah, I think one of the ongoing missions of TEPHI is to address exactly what you're describing there. And we have some questions that have come in that I get first dibs, by the way.
Sure, no, go ahead.
Okay, so because several people that I've talked to in ramping up for this webinar, I think perhaps they don't understand the restrictions of both people and products getting off the ships. And I don't know if you could speak to that or not. But
Sure.
Yeah. So I don't think the average person gets that.
There's multi-layer of security. I didn't really go into that, but
right. But just philosophically, I think
basically, there's several layers of security. We have a role in them. The Coast Guard obviously is in charge of security on the water. And so they monitor vessels coming in and out. We also have Customs and Border Protection, which was reorganized after 9/11, and they're really more in charge of the cargo itself. And they monitor it both from the place of depart, if there's a foreign place of departure, and when it comes in. So, for example, they man facilities at our 2 container terminals that are radiation portal monitors, they're called RPMs. And each container goes through those to make sure there's no nuclear material in them. But then they are really in charge of those areas. We as Port Houston, as the operator of the terminal, and particularly as the operator of a public terminal, don't have a lot of visibility necessarily in what the cargoes are. I mean, sometimes, for example, let's just say it's explosive. We're going to know that because there has to be special measures made. If it has to be what's called a reefer, which is a refrigerated container that has to be kept cold, we'll have special arrangements. But typically, what's actually in a container or what's actually in some of these packages, we don't have visibility. We rely on our federal partners to do that. The area of security that we do have charge of is the actual terminal security. If you come to any of our terminals where we're in charge of security, you have to have a driver's license or what's called a TWIC card if you're working there on a regular basis, transit worker identification. And we monitor that. We have security people that monitor that. So we're more in charge of the security of the facility itself. And again, that's monitored by the Coast Guard, but we have a security staff that does it. We also have police that cooperate with that, but their job is also to make sure things don't get stolen. So it's a partnership type of a role that each of the agencies work together to make sure. And knock on wood, it's proven to be an effective deterrent for for things that can happen. I mean, there's always you'll hear a story now and then about there was a stowaway dog recently in a container, and so things will happen. But I think even then we learned about that dog on site, so the security worked the way it was supposed to work.
Interesting. So I'm going to pause and get to Rocio. It looks like there's some chat questions there. I've scribbled down some, but I'm going to Rocio, are you on? Or you may be muted. I'm not sure.
I'm on.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Sure. Give me 1 second.
Okay. Yeah.
Is there still a strict implementation on health checks for those who dock and step in via the port for ships that came in from other places other than Houston Port?
No, we no longer do that health check, but I will say that because of the federal requirements, there's only limited access for the folks who man the vessels outside of their vessel itself. And we actually have a nonprofit here, the Houston International Seafarer Center, that helps provide transportation for those folks, and they actually did work to provide vaccines to people during the height of the the necessity for those things. But we no longer do health checks. We rely on the vessel itself to be monitoring the health of its passenger, its crew.
Okay, perfect. Next question is, what are the responsibilities for infectious disease inspection of food products or other items that can be transmit human pathogens between Port Houston, USDA, and Port Security District?
Well, I see that the questioner is a ringer here because he used to work for us. So this guy, he should be able to answer that question. No, I'm joking. That again, that's a partnership. We actually, I mean, one example, and Scott Forbes, who asked the question, will recall that one of the areas of a concern is it's not exactly infectious disease, but things like insects. And so, believe it or not, a lot of cargo comes in. Well, I mean, it's obvious, comes in wooden crates. And those wooden crates can have vectors in them that we need to make sure don't come in and damage our own trees. So that again is part of the federal responsibility. A lot of that I would put on the shoulders of the Customs and Border Protection folks. We do actually, and Scott, you'll find this coincidental, we actually have just put together with the work of some of our trade development folks, who's one of them is somebody you may know. We've actually working a little bit more closely with a federal agency to put in place a special program to do that. But in past years, that really was not something, and this program is just starting up, so that will allow us to monitor cargoes that could be particularly sensitive in terms of some of those things. But again, a lot of that role is really, and I'm not trying to cop out, it's just the way the federal government has divided responsibility. A lot of that role falls on the shoulders of our federal partners.
So, Rocio, do you have any more questions there?
Not at this time. Do you have any questions?
I do. Yeah. My other scribbled note here is I'm just curious, as this whole event was emerging early on, and as best I remember, the outbreak was in Wuhan, and then there were other issues that occurred. Does the port, maybe the Coast Guard does this, but would they prohibit the receipt of materials from a certain area? I don't understand and I suspect many people on this call don't understand, how would that decision be made about a ship that's coming in from an area that's perceived to be affected? If that's I don't know if that's the right terminology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I have to defer a little bit. That did not happen to us. I'm not hands-on knowledgeable. I think that was more typical with cruise ships and things like that. But I do know that that would not have been our job. Again, I don't like to cop out, but the way the respective responsibilities are allocated under our system, I think if it was cargo, that would have been CBP. If we were talking about crew, I think that would likely have been the Coast Guard. And even to this day, when there are crew issues, recently we had periodically we'll have crew issues that come up, and crew members taken sick. Often the Coast Guard is going to take, working obviously with the operator of the vessel, they're going to be hands-on on those types of situations, and then
Mhm.
defer to their authority, because at the end of the day,
Mhm.
the answer in those areas to the Coast Guard and to the CBP.
Interesting. And I would imagine now that you describe it, that the cruise ship would be a greater risk than
Right.
some, you know,
Right.
a large cargo ship. Yeah.
I don't recall having that being an issue that we had to grapple with. I do think we had times where we had crew members who were ill, and they were kept aboard. I mean, they didn't, you know, they're fellow crew members who wanted to go to Walmart or wherever they like to do when they visit here.
Right.
They isolated the crew member, and so we didn't have to deal with that firsthand.
I think they want to go to Buc-ee's.
Well, you know, that maybe it's going to be some, but most of them probably never heard of it yet. But, you know, who knows with the way Bucky's growing. But believe it or not, Best Buy and Walmart are two
Yes.
big places. I mean, years and years ago, it's sort of
Yeah.
funny when the Seafair Center was
Mm.
opened up, it would have been bars and places like that. But nowadays, they just want to go to a big box store.
That's funny. That's actually pretty funny. All right, let me circle back to Rocio. Are we any other thing? Anything came in?
No more questions.
Okay, so a couple of housekeeping notes here. So this is recorded and it will be posted. And Eric, just from time to time, people who view this at a later date may come up with some questions. So just want to make sure it's okay. We could email to you.
Absolutely, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Communication with our public is, you know, it's part of my job, and it's part of our duty.
Okay, great. No, it's good. I think it's eye-opening. I did not fully appreciate the scope and scale of this thing. It's pretty big operation there. So, but thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And again, to just kind of circle back to the main point here is that everybody's tired of COVID. I get it. But we do need to address those questions about things like you mentioned for the, you know, the influenza in 1918. There's some certain lessons we don't want to forget there, because inevitably the next one's coming, and that's really the mission of TEPHI, is for us to make sure we record those things and see how we can put some reasonable steps in place to withstand the next one that's inevitable to occur. So, okay. So
thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you, and thank all of you for participating in this. And we have another talk coming up on April 16th. And Rocio, do you want to talk about that for a second, or?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Emery. Thank you, Eric, for taking the time to be our key speaker today. I want to inform our audience of our upcoming TEPHI talks, Improving Health Through Data, which will take place via Zoom on April 16 at 1 p.m. It will be our key speaker, Dr. Lee Spangler, Executive Director of Texas All-Payer Claim Database, Center for Healthcare Data here at UT Health. Registration will be available on our website soon. Again, we want to thank our audience today for joining us.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.